have this session because there is an order of court that said we must do these interviews afresh. And we thank you for coming back.
Not at all.
Thank you. I'll ask you some questions, and thereafter I will allow commissioners to ask questions. I see that in terms of your academic qualifications, you hold a BA, LLB, BCL, and MA. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
Yes. The BA you got it at Cambridge. The LLB you got at Wits, BCL at Oxford, and MA at Cambridge.
That's correct.
Yes. And for most of your working life, you have been also attached to universities as a lecturer and professor. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. Ever since I started at the bar, I have held academic positions, and I took some time out from the bar to be the director of the Center for Applied Legal Studies and to found the Mandela Institute, which has played a role in human rights work in various forms. And then I returned to the bar, but continued to hold academic positions and held a chair at Wits and thereafter at the University of Cape Town.
Is the position that throughout the time that you were at university teaching, including applied, I think, legal studies or Center for Applied Legal Studies, you were practicing part-time and also teaching part-time, or how were you managing?
Well, the way it worked was this, that when I took up the directorship of CALS, I actually stepped away from the bar because I was the director of CALS, and that was a full-time job other than very incidental practice. Similarly, when I started the Mandela Institute, I did much the same thing. But once the Mandela Institute was on its feet and we'd raised considerable monies for it and got it going, I then went back to the bar and then did my academic work on a more part-time basis.
Yes. So when would it have been when you went back to the bar, in terms of which year, more or less?
I can tell you, if you give me one moment. So the Mandela Institute started in 2000, and around 2002 or 3, I went back to the bar full-time.
Yes. And is the position that mostly your practice consisted of human rights kind of cases, constitutional law, admin law, as well as competition law, and some commercial law?
Well, ACJ, if I would like to explain one thing which perhaps I didn't explain clearly enough when last I was here.
Yes.
Which is that before I accepted a position on the bench, I did spend some 11 years serving in a judicial capacity, and perhaps I didn't explain this carefully enough last time, but let me do so now, if I may just have a moment.
Yes.
I was nominated by South Africa to sit on the appellate body of the World Trade Organization. And let me explain that that body is effectively the world's trade court. So I represented, effectively, since regional representation is fundamental to being on that court, I was the African representative regionally for the World Court on Trade. And I sat on that court for 8 years and was the head of that court for 2 years. The kinds of disputes that that court hears are disputes between members of the WTO concerning trade disputes that cover a very wide range of issues that deal with environmental, health, subsidies, a whole gamut of fundamental features of trade that affect members of the WTO. And before I was nominated and was selected as one of the 7 members of the appellate body, I served for some 4 years on the Court of First Instance of the WTO, which is the panel stage after which appeals go to the appellate body, for 4 years. So if we calculate my judicial service during the time, before I took up a position on the High Court, I had served some 11 years in a judicial capacity, including heading for 2 years the appellate body. And so when it was said of me in the deliberations that I had but 3.5 years judicial service, I have to say that that was simply not correct. I have in total served some nearly 15 years as a judge. And the WTO court, the appellate body, certainly at the time that I served in that court, was probably the busiest international court of the many international courts that exist in the world. So I do at least want to bring that to your attention, because it is the court that served the WTO, and it is a court in which its members, including critically developing countries, have got a significant way of litigating fundamental disputes that affect their economies and their trade relationships multilaterally with many trading nations in the world. And so those disputes were large and complex and involved many, many important issues for the member countries of the WTO. And I did want at least to make that plain to you all.
So from which year up to which year did you serve in that?
Yes, so I have the figures, the dates for you there. So from 2003 to 2006, I was on the panel, at the panel stage of the WTO, and then I was then appointed then for 8 years thereafter onto the appellate body. So cumulatively 11 years of service in a judicial capacity in the WTO. And that was during the period that after I finished at the Mandela Institute. And so although I was at the bar for some 27 years, and it was said of me that I had, or the suggestion was that I had somehow left it rather late to come to the High Court. In truth, during the 27 years that I practiced at the bar, I was involved in a number of different other capacities, including the academic ones that I've referenced for you, ACJ, as well as 11 years of judicial service, including in a leadership role of that court.
Well, I have no doubt that sitting on such a body is quite important and has to be given proper weight. But I just want to find out whether when you say you served in a judicial capacity, when you served in that body, you intend to say judicial or you mean adjudicative, simply because you could have a panel of people whose job is to adjudicate certain disputes, but they are not judges in the normal sense, but they perform an adjudicative job. So I just want to understand whether you mean judicial in the true sense or you mean adjudicative.
No, I mean judicial in the true sense, because the appellate body is a permanent, established body of the World Trade Organization. So it's not simply ad hoc tribunals that are constituted from time to time. That is true at the panel stage, but the appellate body is an established institution, established after the Uruguay round, when, because of the huge expansion of the multilateral treaties that underpin the WTO, it was felt important that members who were in disputes with one another could go to a court to resolve those disputes and have those obligations enforced. So one of the features of the appellate body, which is unlike most international courts, is that it was the fundamental mechanism for the enforcement of the rights and obligations under those multilateral treaties with enforcement mechanisms. So I do mean to say that it was a judicial capacity, not an ad hoc adjudicative capacity.
And when you served in that appeal body, were you full-time or you had to go there as and when there was a need for you to deal with some cases?
Well, the way that it works effectively is that you have to be ready, as the relevant treaty indicates, at short notice to serve at any time that an appeal arises. And since there are very demanding time periods as to the periods within which an appeal must be disposed of, although one didn't, as it were, have to sit in Geneva waiting for the cases to come, as soon as a case was referred to the appellate body, you had to make yourself immediately available for those cases because, again, unlike many international institutions, the requirement was that judgment, that is to say the recommendations of the appellate body, had to be rendered in 90 days for the most part. There are very, very big cases, one of which, for example, concerned the subsidies of Airbus and Boeing, which ran for more than a year, but that was a very unusual appeal. Mostly the time periods were demanding and you had to be available at very short notice to go to Geneva and hear the cases.
And in the Competition Appeal Court, you have also acted there, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes. How long did you act there?
I've been acting there since I was appointed to the High Court, but because the last year and a half I've been in the Supreme Court of Appeal, I haven't been acting in the Competition Appeal Court since I took up a position as an acting judge in the Supreme Court of Appeal.
And I saw that you have quite a long list of reported cases that you argued during your time in practice. I think I tried to count, and there seem to be quite many. Do you have an idea about how many there are?
You know, I haven't actually counted precisely, but I have been, I probably have certainly more than 100, probably more like 150 reported decisions. And I should revert back to the question you posed right at the beginning, ACJ, which is to say, well, what did my practice consist of? And I suppose if I were to try and summarize it, I'd say this. I started appearing in the Constitutional Court from the very beginning. I appeared in the certification cases and have appeared many times, many of those times before you. And I maintained a very steady practice in constitutional law throughout my time at the bar, and have seen the entire evolution of our constitutional law through the many cases that I've been involved in that court. But I also practiced extensively in the jurisdiction of competition law, which, as we know, has now flourished as a jurisdiction in South Africa through the institutions created by the Competition Act. And again, there too, I began practicing more or less from the beginning that jurisdiction began, and that became an important part of my practice. But so too did the other aspects of public and regulatory law, for example, involving broadcasting, companies regulation, environmental regulation and the like, so aspects of regulatory law pretty much across the board. And then, obviously, I've also maintained a fairly significant practice in commercial law. So I think if one looks through the cases, and the reported cases are a sort of indication of the range of my practice, it was quite wide-ranging in the different areas in which I gained some specialty.
I know that among the cases that you would have argued in the Constitutional Court and in the High Court would have been quite many which involved declaring pieces of legislation unconstitutional and arguing what remedy should be provided by the court in that situation. But since you started performing duties as a judge after your appointment, have you had judgments which where you have declared pieces of legislation unconstitutional and decided on the appropriate remedy?
Yes, I have. One of the cases that I have referenced in my CV is the Parler case, where it went ultimately to the Constitutional Court, where our decision was affirmed. But there we did set aside the provisions of the legislation as to where the change to the parole regime when persons convicted of murder were eligible for parole, there was a cut-off point which gave rise to a constitutional challenge. And there we did indicate that the basis upon which that change had actually come into force gave rise to inequality. And so we did declare that to be unconstitutional with provisions as to how that was to be rectified.
Mm-hmm. Now, it is said that different countries have different models of separation of powers and that South Africa has got its own. Would you like to share your views with the commissioners on the South African model of the separation of powers?
Yes, certainly. Our doctrine of separation of powers is not contained in any single feature of the Constitution. One has to, as it were, piece it together in different places. But just to give some of the features of how I think the separation of powers is articulated through the Constitution is firstly, of course, the role that the courts are required to play. So the very significant powers of both constitutional and administrative review and the oversight role that is given to the courts to uphold the Constitution is not just about a simple separation of the courts from the executive and legislative wings, but obviously the very significant oversight role that the courts have in respect of requiring the executive and the legislature to adhere to the significant rights that are accorded under the Constitution. So that's the first feature, which is a very large jurisdiction and gives rise naturally to border issues as to whether, as some people think, courts sometimes go too far or do not, but that's one feature of the separation of powers. The second is issues around the oversight role that Parliament is intended to play over the executive. Some people believe that under the implementation of our Constitution, that has been a rather underdeveloped feature of the division of powers, but it's a hugely significant one, and one that the Constitutional Court has had to remind Parliament of from time to time. And then in respect of the executive, of course, it is tiered as to the different levels of government, but there's also a requirement of cooperative government. So we have developed a model which is not just about how powers are distributed, but also how they are to be used in a fashion that can resolve potential boundary disputes between different parts of government and not simply give rise to unnecessary disputes of this kind. Again, a feature of our Constitution that is unusual and not always articulated in comparable constitutions. So one has to look at the division of powers by reference to different parts of the Constitution, and it's still a doctrine that is being articulated through cases, but we definitely have a distinctive division of powers and separation doctrine under the Constitution.
And one of the judgments that many people, even who are not lawyers in South Africa, know about is what we refer to as the Incandel judgment. Would you share your views with the commissioners as to what you think is the jurisprudential significance of that judgment in South Africa?
Well, I think the significance of that judgment is that it is perhaps one of the more challenging instances in which the court is confronted with the question of whether there has been a species of abuse that has arisen. And one of the lines that is always difficult to navigate is where decisions are of a political kind, where courts are not required and in fact shouldn't go, and circumstances where fidelity to the Constitution and upholding the Constitution is absolutely vital to institutional integrity and the maintenance of the values of the Constitution. And the Incandel case is just such an instance of holding presidential office to the requirements, including the oath of office, that is taken by presidents. So we give to the president of the country enormous powers because they are intended to be articulated and used to achieve constitutional and social and political purposes. But when there is a straying from the proper exercise of those powers, it is the courts that must hold presidential power to account, and that's essentially what was done.
Thank you, commissioners. Commissioner Madonsela.
Thank you, Chief Justice. And good afternoon, Justice Unterhalter.
Good afternoon.
I just want to ask two questions with the permission, Chief Justice. And I would like to be given.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Okay, thank you.
And I would like to be given the latitude to ask these questions in light of what has happened in these interviews.
I'm sorry, did you say you would like to ask more than two?
I would like to ask to be given some latitude in asking these questions because of what has happened.
Yeah, okay.
In the context of these interviews.
Okay.
I would be guarded in asking the questions, obviously. Mr. Unterhalter, you know already that we have received objections to your candidature, principally from the BLA and some other body called the Boycott Coalition, if I can just paraphrase the name of that institution, BDS. Now, we have to raise the issues with you so that you would deal with them head on, and then we can address them in our deliberations. You have read, I'm not going to go at length, I'm sure you have read the objections, and they pertain to you the fact that you accepted nomination as a member of the Jewish Board of Deputies in South Africa. What I want to ask you about that is this. It seems to me that the fundamental premise of both objections is the assertion that the Jewish Board of Deputies is a body that is pro-Zionist and that is, in fact, bullying all other people and organizations who are objecting to the Israeli establishment in the Palestine region. Is that premise correct?
In my view, the premise, completely correctly summarized by you with respect, is incorrect. Members of the Jewish community in this country, as in many other countries, hold a very wide variety of views about Zionism and the State of Israel. That is why people who are Zionists subscribe to organizations that bear that name and seek to pursue that particular political agenda. The Jewish Board of Deputies is a body that existed long before the State of Israel was ever created and has its roots in the 19th century in this country, where it is simply founded and was founded to look after the interests of a particular community, in this instance, the Jewish community, and largely to take care of its welfare, as many community organizations representing many different parts of our society do. It was on that premise that during COVID, when there were peculiarly large demands placed on the welfare, not just of the Jewish community, but also in respect of its charitable work with other communities, that I accepted a position on the Jewish Board of Deputies, thinking that it could be of some service to the community and the work that it did for the Jewish community. There was, when I was nominated and came before you before, the objections of the kind that you have indicated, saying that effectively that showed my commitment to Zionism, which, according to these bodies, is antithetical to the Constitution, and hence I should not be favorably considered for appointment to the Constitutional Court. That proceeds exactly from the premise that you have stated, and which is wrong. It was not the reason why I joined. I would not have joined on that basis. And as you will have noticed, I resigned from the Jewish Board of Deputies because I recognized a different error, which is that the Jewish Board of Deputies litigates cases dealing with anti-Semitism, and some of those cases have come to the Constitutional Court, and it seemed to me unwise for me to potentially seek appointment to a body where the Jewish Board of Deputies might be litigating cases. And consequently, it seemed to me better to stand down. And that's precisely what I did. I recognized that that was an error, probably of judgment that I had made. And sometimes it's a feature of judges that they should recognize when they make mistakes, and that was one.
Yes. No, it's a follow-up on the position of the Jewish Board of Deputies. I just want to understand, does the Jewish Board of Deputies in South Africa currently and last year, when you accepted nomination to it, did it hold a particular view about the Israeli establishment in the Palestine region?
Not certainly while I was there. The Constitution makes no commitment to Zionism of any kind, and none of the issues that I was concerned with had anything whatever to do with Zionism.
No, I'm asking whether the Jewish Board of Deputies propagated.
Not as far as I know.
I just want latitude on this one, thank you. On the second reason why you stood down in the face of the objection from the BLA was, as you stated and you repeated today, that it's because of the involvement of the Jewish Board of Deputies in litigation in matters relating to hate speech and anti-Semitism. Now, my recollection is that when you were interviewed initially for the position of the judge in the North Gauteng High Court, I think, or in South Gauteng, you were pressed on your views around your membership or even involvement with the Helen Suzman Foundation. And then you expressed at that time that when you assume the position of a judge, you immediately disengage with the bodies with which you're involved. Around that, then I got so surprised when you then took up position as a member of the Jewish Board when you know that it is a litigating body. I would have thought that you would try to disengage with it from that perspective.
I understand the point you're making, and I think the answer to that is just simply the one that I've given to you, which is that I joined it on the basis that it was facing very considerable demands in a time of COVID, with all the problems of the pandemic that we all know about. And I saw it simply as a contribution that I could possibly make to this community and other communities that it serves in respect of welfare issues. That's how I saw it. I didn't really think carefully enough in retrospect that there is also litigation that it undertakes and so on. And I recognize entirely that had I had that at the front of my mind, it would have been a reason not to do so, and I shouldn't, in retrospect, have done so, given that that was so. But, you know, I have to simply say to you that at a time of considerable social need in many communities across this country, it just seemed an aspect of service that I could make that didn't contradict my judicial activity. But I can see that there is a potential problem, and that's why I've dealt with it.
Yes, Chief Justice, that was the component of my first question. Now I want to move to the second question, with your permission.
I think this is what Commissioner Malema was talking about. That one question it takes long. Okay.
The second question.
Okay.
I just want to, on the second question is, it has to do with your judicial functions currently. You have delivered, between April and now, a judgment in Capitec. I'm asking you this question in the context of that judgment. Do you think that the jurisprudence of our courts currently on contractual interpretation are adequate, or is adequate, to regulate commerce between contracting parties? I ask because it seems to me that in the Capitec judgment, which you penned recently, you revisited the judgment of the SCA in Endumeni, and of course the constitutional judgments in Auckland Park and Kumwendo relating to admission of extraneous evidence in the parallel evidence rule. Do you think that the jurisprudence thus far requires refinement or revisitation or overruling?
Well, let
Will
me...
you also touch also on the other judgment that I've not mentioned, the Badieka judgment?
Yes.
Insofar as it relates to public policy considerations in contractual interpretation.
Yes. So the Capitec judgment, which came out after I made my application, so it wouldn't necessarily have been before the JSE, but it really touched on three issues, I think all of some importance. The first was a yet further revisiting in respect of Endumeni and how we approach interpretation. And although that judgment has been repeated many, many times over in our courts, it did seem to me that there were at least a couple of things in addition to say about the interpretation of commercial contracts. One of them being that there is often a commercial logic that underpins those judgments, and trying to understand that logic can be extremely important, so that a coherent interpretation is one that seeks to grapple with the interrelated parts of the whole commercial scheme within which an agreement works. And I sought to develop and emphasize some of the relational aspects of interpretation, which, although are part of our interpretational scheme, I think sought to accentuate some features of interpretation. The second feature of Capitec, though, was to try to reconcile two important doctrines, which is the wide scheme of interpretation, which has reference to text, context, and purpose, which gives a wide remit to the kind of extrinsic evidence that might be utilized for the purposes of interpreting contracts, and the parallel evidence rule. And what I sought to illustrate in Capitec is that because of our wide scheme of interpretation and the use of extrinsic evidence, it was rendering parallel evidence as something of a residual feature of our jurisprudence. And I wanted to bring that out, not because it's necessarily wrong, but simply logically, that's where these matters lead to. And then finally, it was to try and understand and indeed re-emphasize what had been said by the Constitutional Court in respect of good faith, which is that it isn't an independent doctrine that one can simply have direct recourse to for the purposes of seeking to discipline contracts, but one has to see how it is articulated through contractual doctrine, and in particular through the articulation of public policy. And in this particular case, I did find that the court below had simply strayed into a rather diffuse understanding of good faith as a sort of general notion that you can use whenever you think the equities favor a particular outcome, and that is not my view either as to what the Constitutional Court has said, nor as I sought to interpret it for the purposes of applying the reasoning of the Constitutional Court in the Capitec judgment.
I wish I could engage more, but I think there are other questions.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Nuchesi.
Thank you, sir. I think in the past 27 years, the rescission application brought by the former president to the Constitutional Court was the sort of a big test to our constitutional democracy. And thanks that rescission comes shortly after you and your colleagues have delivered the De Beer judgment, and the approach you adopt in the De Beer judgment being that that let the matter be referred to the NPA to deal with the condemned part. Let it be referred to the NPA. Now, if you sit, if you are not comfortable with this question, okay, if you sit and reflect and say, this is a De Beer judgment which I gave, and shortly this is a Constitutional Court judgment on the rescission of former President Zuma, would you say your judgment was in accordance with the Constitutional and international law, or the Constitutional Court judgment was compliant with the Constitution and the SCA? I mean, just if you reflect on these two, because they just come and it's what every South African is interested to understand.
Yes, so let me explain that the panel of the Supreme Court of Appeal that decided the De Beer case was concerned with certain provisions of the regulations undertaken under the National Disaster Act, which had been set aside by the High Court. Our decision was that the basis upon which that review had taken place was not correct, and that the regulations withstood scrutiny. An entirely subsidiary part of the De Beer case was the conduct of the particular litigant, Mr. De Beer, who had, in a series of engagements both with the court that heard the case as well as with the president of the court, acted in a fashion that we considered to be entirely contemptuous. And so we simply thought that in that circumstance we would refer that matter to the NDPP for any prosecution that might be thought warranted. In the case of the Constitutional Court, there was a separate question as to whether there was, again, a direct contempt that had been shown to the Constitutional Court. And it is permissible, at least as I understand the matter, and certainly the majority judgment in the Constitutional Court, for the court to take the view that it will itself then deal with the contempt that has been shown. So it doesn't seem to me that these are inconsistent approaches. They're just different approaches that can be taken. And there is, of course, a minority view that's thought that the fair trial provisions required a different approach. But there is a very long line of decisions, and ultimately the majority found that it was perfectly competent for the Constitutional Court to have decided the matter as it did, and that's where our law now stands.
No, I understand that. But in this case, coincidentally, in the appeal judgment, you agree with the minority if I go through. But let's
I'm
leave
not
that.
certain, just to be clear, that it's so much a matter of agreement.
No,
It's simply that we
that's
just took a different route.
Okay, that's fine. Let's go to my second question. The second question is, look, since, the past 27 years, and we talk about the jurisprudence that has been developed by the Constitutional Court, would you say have the court develop an African jurisprudence or a jurisprudence that advances the African jurisprudence? Right, except to say we apply customary law, I don't talk about that. For instance, let's say in other areas of law, criminal law, law of contract, because African law do cut across onto that.
So I think I have two responses to your question. The first is I would say that we have developed, and the Constitutional Court has developed, very much a South African jurisprudence, which is to say that our Constitution is distinctive and its values are distinctive, and it reflects both our history and our present in a whole variety of ways. And the way in which the court has developed it has been about recognizing where we've come from and where we're going, and some of the critical values that underpin the Constitution is very much part of what has been developed within the courts and the Constitutional Court. I think you're correct, though, if this is the implication of your question, that the role, certainly, of customary law is an underdeveloped feature. Most especially, although the Constitution in a number of places recognizes the application of customary law and actually recognizes that customary law should be developed, it does seem, I think, a fair point to make that customary law is a dynamic part of law is not an area that has perhaps had as much attention as could have and should have. And it's probably likely that it will have a much bigger role to play than it has in the past. So I think that that's a fair point that you make.
Look, if I may just follow up just to, look, for instance, if in the principles of punishment, for example, I'm making an example, we have infused the value of Ubuntu rather than limiting yourself to the triad, the Zin triad. You wouldn't send an 8-year-old to jail for not attending court. You would rather ask him to go to where he's supposed to go. If you build, but if you rigidly apply the revengeful common law approach, you'll take him to prison. You see, those things.
You know, I would like to believe, for example, in relation to punishment, that the common law principles don't just reflect retributive aspects of punishment, but recognize other aspects of punishment that are meant to be both about deterrence, certainly, but also about restoration and rehabilitation. Now, quite whether the balance is correctly struck, you may be right that we could learn a great deal more about other forms of customary law which infuse either additional values or overlapping values with different emphasis. And those arguments are arguments to be made before the courts, because punishment is a discretionary feature of our jurisprudence, where perhaps too often there is too mechanistic an approach that is taken. You know, part of the problem that we have is that we often have cases where there have been pretty terrible crimes committed, and perhaps courts need to carefully discipline themselves that the retributive instinct that is necessary isn't always overwhelming, but is tempered with other values, including the quality of mercy, which is an important attribute that we need to bring to justice.
The last question is just a follow-up to your debate with the DCJ. Somebody argues, correctly or incorrectly, I haven't followed it up, that you are correct to say in the Constitution you can't find a section which actually say there shall be separation of powers in the Republic. You have to add and find it. where in the Constitution, or how would you locate the Chapter 9 institutions that support the Constitution, like public protector? Where would you locate within the spheres of government, I mean the spheres that we have, or the arms of government that we have? Where would you feature those institutions? Would you feature them in the executive or the legislature? Or how would you describe them within the context of the Constitution? I'm asking this because if the public protector, it has been agreed on many times that his powers are binding, you review, but certainly at a later stage, there is a shift of interpretation coming from the courts, which where you say, no, can't go to this level, can't go. Where would you locate this institution? I think this is the last.
Yes, well, I think actually the public protector and other allied institutions don't fall within a sort of formal concept of the separation of powers, because they're not formally about government. They're about how to support the constitutional project. So they fall into a slightly different category. But the issue then has always been, as we know, well, are these decisions binding, and in what way must they be respected? And we know what the jurisprudence has had to say about that. But of course, as with every power that is granted, significant as those powers have limits, just as the courts, although they have hugely important powers as independent institutions, their powers are limited, and they must respect the boundaries of the powers that they've been given. So you have to both understand the constitutional function of the public protector, but the public protector has also to respect the limitations of the office that is occupied, just as judges do, just as every body that has powers must do. And so I would say it's less a question of separation of powers, but more factor that we recognize the binding nature of the public protector's determinations. But we also, as with every other body that has powers, apply doctrine as to what are the limits of those powers. Every constitutional order depends upon recognizing the limitation of power as well as the enforcement of power, and that's what the great debate around the public protector's office has been about.
Thank you, Commissioner. Then it will now be Commissioner Moimang.
Thank you, Acting Chief Justice. Good afternoon, Mr. Unterhalter. What is your understanding of negative judicial activism and positive judicial activism? Apply that within the context of the latest case of the Concord of the IEC, where the literal interpretation of the text of the Constitution on the term of local council was at play. I want you to draw a parallel with that, with something that was, it's a proposition that was made in the State versus Makwanyane case, where at the beginning the court said that the courts were not empowered to make any modification, alterations, or additions to the legal text, as this is the function of the legislature. But of course, they were able to apply that positively to move as a transitional route from apartheid laws to constitutional democracy. But also, what bothers me is paralleling that with what the former Chief Justice St. Lever said in the Collins matter in 1957, that if the provisions of the law are clear, we as a court are not concerned with the propriety of the legislation or policy of the legislature, our duty is to administer and interpret. You see. I got a sense that the Concord is descending into conservatism because they overlooked the pandemic through which we are going through and just restrict itself to say within 90 days after the 5-year term, you must go to election, irrespective as to whether, as we do door-to-door, transmitting the virus from one place to the other happens. It was none of their issue. Thank you, Acting Chief Justice.
Well, let me begin, if I may, just with your first distinction between negative and positive judicial activism. I mean, it is often a label that is attached to whether parties believe that the right or the wrong answer was achieved by the court. So when the right answer is achieved, it's positive judicial activism. When the wrong answer is achieved, it's negative. And these labels are often just stand-ins for whether particular litigants and people in society think a court has got things right or has got things wrong. As far as the IEC case is concerned, I'm not certain, at least on my reading of it, and there were 2 sets of judgments, as you will know, that this was simply any form of literalism around the provisions concerning the term within which the elections had to be taken. Because I think the court was very concerned to understand whether the prospect of a free and fair election was possible within the scheme of a society that was subject to the pandemic and its many restrictions. And it grappled with this problem as to whether it was still possible to have a free and fair election under these conditions. And the judgments took different views about what was to be said about that. But I'm not certain whether the ultimate answer was an answer that simply said, well, we're just going to adopt a totally literalist view of the legislation. I think the real anxiety that the court had to work with is that there was obviously a desire that the mandate from the people must be renewed, and that's what is required, and that itself is a particular constitutional value, as against the issue as to whether the electorate would have a free and fair election, have their say to exercise their fundamental rights. And that is always a kind of difficult balancing act to play. So I must say my own reading would not be to suggest that this is some assertion of a kind of very conservative literalism, but simply an exercise in a difficult case as to how to deal with a provision that requires that something be done by a particular period, and the issue as to how to balance up the kinds of rights that are at stake in respect of that time period. So it wasn't just an empty formalism to say we adhere to the period just for the sake of it, but because the mandate of the people in respect of an election is a very fundamental feature of a democracy, and that's itself an important constitutional value. But of course the people must be able to decide in a free and fair way, and that was what was being balanced up, as I read the judgments in that case.
Within the doctrine of the separation of powers between the IEC and the courts, which one will be much more better?
I'm sorry, can you just speak up so we can hear you?
Thank you, Acting Chief Justice. Within the doctrine of the separation of powers, and with the available expertise at the disposal of the IEC and the amount of efforts that the IEC draw as part and parcel of preparing yourself for the election, don't you think that in this instance, given the doctrine of the separation of powers, the IEC was better placed to understand the ramifications of whether it will be detrimental to the voters to go to the election or not?
Well, I'm not certain that I would see it as a straightforward separation of powers question. I mean, you're absolutely correct that in the first place, the constitutional responsibility for organizing and running free and fair elections is that of the IEC. And there are many decisions that they have to take that they are best placed to make, and courts are certainly not well positioned to make in respect of discharging that constitutional mandate. But of course, as with every other body or authority that has power, the question is how does the exercise of that power measure up against the constitutional norms? And that's where courts are not seeking to do the job of the IEC. They're seeing whether the job that has been done by the IEC does or does not measure up to the constitutional value. So, as you know, these kinds of problems repeat themselves over and over again, and I think courts are fairly careful to show deference to authorities in respect of the areas where they have special expertise and where it's certainly not for the courts to go. But on an issue such as whether the democratic mandate needs to be renewed and that particular constitutional value, ultimately courts are given these powers under the Constitution to decide whether there's been a constitutional infringement or not. And that has to be measured up against what the authority has done. But it is done within a scheme of recognizing that it is the IEC and its judgments in the first place that one must give very close attention to, because they are the people who discharge the mandate in the first place.
Thank you, Justice Unterhalter. Thank you, Acting Chief Justice.
Thank you. Then now it will be Commissioner Magwenisha.
No, thank you very much, Acting Chief Justice. Good afternoon, Judge
Good
Unterhalter.
afternoon.
No, I have only 2 questions. Yeah, it's only 2 questions. I'll strictly to 2. From 1989 to 1994, you were a member of the Democratic Party. And then you resigned in 1994. Can you share with us why did you resign from the Democratic Party in 1994?
I just found that I was pretty inept in any political realm altogether, and felt much better and more assured in pursuing a career at the bar and in law. And I think my judgment was correct in this instance.
The last one, Chair, I'll stick to the commitment I made, Acting Chief Justice.
Yes. And the good thing is there is no preamble.
No preambles,
Yeah.
no preambles.
Okay.
It's the question I asked last time. I hope you will be more direct this time. I asked how many black and women female juniors were you able to include in your high-profile cases, which are not only focusing on the international trade law, but the whole spectrum of your practice, spanning over the many years you have been in practice.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Well, I have had occasion to look at all of that, and I can say that between black juniors and women juniors, I would have included, the list I have here probably runs to about 30 or 35 names. But let me just say that not only did I involve them in my practice in areas of, say, pro bono work, which I did on many human rights cases, but I involved them in my practice in every aspect of my practice. And so it is actually a matter of personal pride to me that many of the persons that I worked with closely are now leading figures in the bar. So obviously, Mr. Nkaitobe, Sisilana, I mean, I've got a list of them here that I can read to you. Mr. Makola, Mr. Shozi, Mr. Malindi, Mr. Misimang, Ms. Goodman, Ms. Hofmeyr, Ms. LaRue. I have a very long list of people here, but although the list is long, what I think I would want to emphasize for you is that I did it not to build some impressive list to one day tell you about in a hearing of this kind. But I did it because there are people of wonderful talent who come to the bar, and many of them take time to be recognized for the talents that they have. And there are many opportunities for me to seek to work with them and gain much insight from working with them, but also help in different ways to develop their practices and the kind of quality that they have as practitioners. And I am delighted that today many of those practitioners are now leading members of the profession, and they discharge leadership roles within the bar, and they are excellent practitioners. And if there's one thing ultimately to be gratified by, that I hope, involvement with these enormously talented people, any contribution one can make to giving their careers a push in the right direction, I think is a wonderful thing to do. So you're very welcome to the names. I can list them for you in detail, but I'm perfectly satisfied that I had very significant involvements with black practitioners and women, very worthwhile, creative, and fruitful working relationships with them that were of great benefit to me, and I think of quite considerable benefit to them as well.
Thank you, Acting Chief Justice. Thank you, Judge.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now it will be the Minister.
Good afternoon, Judge Unterhalter. Yeah, I just want to check, you know, sitting here, I'm debating with myself or not yet convinced about the WTO body being a judicial function. And I want to just ask, why in the international courts, there are the International Court of Justice, all those. I know that there could be courts that are not called courts, where you perform those judicial. Why didn't they just call it an international WTO court to make it so easy for us to understand? Because as sitting here, I think it will be a debate as we go to the closed session, whether is that a court or is not a real judicial function or tribunal or whatever.
Yes, Minister, let me try and explain why the appellate body is called the appellate body and not the appellate trade court, as it were. It has to do with particular way in which the dispute settlement agreement, which is the agreement under which the dispute resolution mechanisms of the WTO were constituted, the way in which it was negotiated. There's a very unusual structure within the WTO, which is that the appellate body, which is the final body to which you can go to litigate a dispute, makes what is called a recommendation at the end of the hearing. And the members of the WTO take that recommendation, but here is the important point about it. The recommendation has to be compulsorily adopted by the membership of the WTO unless what is called negative consensus applies, which means the winning party chooses to give up the benefit of the decision that has been made by the appellate body. And that was just a question of delicacies in the way in which the WTO agreements were negotiated. But the critical point, and this is why people who spend time in this area know full well what the position is. The reason that the appellate body is in all but name a court is because that is the body that makes the final decision in respective trade disputes under the multilateral agreements of the WTO. its decisions are final, they are binding, they have to be adopted, and there are sanctions and consequences that flow from a party that doesn't adhere to the determination that the appellate body has made. It's a permanently established body. It's not an ad hoc tribunal. And so unless one wishes to say that all international bodies of this kind aren't courts because they aren't national courts, I must say I would be, in terms of the actual functionality of what the appellate body does, the binding nature of its decisions, the responsibilities that it carries, and the kinds of disputes that it determines, I must say I cannot for a moment understand how it is different from the highest courts of most national institutions.
Okay, yeah, my second question relates to the issue of the vaccine, which, as you will be aware, the criticism to the well-established countries about vaccine nationalism. Don't you think the WTO, or what has been your role to advance the interests of developing countries, third world countries? Because it seems so easy for these big or well-established or well-to-do countries to hog this vaccine. And it also does appear that they seem to be protected by the rules of the WTO and the various rules, so they can do this. And I want to believe they can also do it in any sector of the economy. So what has been your role to advance the interests of developing countries in that platform of the WTO so that we don't find ourselves with this kind of situation of the vaccine we are finding ourselves today?
Yes. So let me firstly deal with my role, and then I'll briefly refer to the question of the vaccines and the TRIPS agreement. But as I indicated in some of my introductory remarks, there are 7 members who sit on the appellate body. They come from different parts of the world, but there is intended to be roughly regional representativity in the appellate body, and I was the African member in that sense of representativity on the appellate body. The others came from China, from the United States, from Europe, from Brazil, and the like, Mexico. So it was a selected body from across the world in which regional representativity mattered. Now, there was no, it's a court, so plainly it's an independent institution. It has to decide the cases on the basis of its understanding of the law and the proper application of the law. But the key feature of the dispute settlement system, which has very real resonance for developing countries, is that the WTO is an institution that is a rule-based order. So the treaties that have been concluded are rules, and they are enforceable rules, and members can go to the appellate body to have those rights and obligations enforced. And many developing countries have used the dispute settlement system to their great advantage because they have held developed countries to the rules of international trade. So just to give you an example, Brazil was enormously successful in eliminating unlawful cotton subsidies that were restricting its abilities to export products to the United States. And similarly, other developing countries have used the WTO and the dispute settlement system to advance their trade agendas, because if you can get favorable rulings and the enforcement of rules in your favor, it gives you access to markets, it promotes employment, it promotes economic development, and that can be fundamentally important to developing countries. And so I would say that the rule-based order has been of very great significance to developing countries, and because of the systemic consequences of that rule-based order and its interpretations by the appellate body, it has created an order in which export-led growth by developing countries has been fundamentally important. Let me give you the most salient example of all. China joined the WTO. It is generally considered to have been one of the most fundamental things that happened in terms of promoting its export-led growth, which has almost certainly changed the economic face of the world. And that's one, of course, extremely big and extremely important developing country, but the same principles can apply for others. So what did we do? We applied and considered the rules in a way that was an dispassionate, rule-based order available to all members to use for the purposes of getting the benefit of the rules that had been agreed to and applied on a dispassionate basis. Very lastly and quickly on TRIPS, which is the agreement that is relevant to the vaccines. South Africa and India, as members of the WTO, have been very active in seeking to negotiate waivers in respect of some of that intellectual property. But the agreements themselves have let out provisions in respect of public health and the like. And one possibility is that cases will be brought to actually utilize some of the exception procedures, both under TRIPS and under the GATT itself, for the purposes of pursuing public health. So the way the system works is not as some club to protect pharmaceutical manufacturers. It's a very nuanced set of rules to balance out certain kinds of rights, but with very significant public interest exceptions, which countries can use, for example, in respect of dealing with public health emergencies. And just such litigation may very well come if there isn't a TRIPS exemption that is finally agreed by the membership.
Thank you. Thank you, Acting CJ.
Thank you, Minister. Commissioner Mpofu.
Thank you. Good afternoon,
Good afternoon.
Judge. Yes, I'm just going to ask you, firstly, just to go, well, it's one question, but it has 2 legs. It might, yes. It's really about some of the criteria and some of the issues and some of the criteria that we apply. And I just wanted to give an opportunity, because I think it's unfair for people to raise things, which have not been put to you. I asked an earlier candidate about this, what I called in his case, 3 ostensible disadvantages. And I've seen some commentary which means people don't understand the word ostensible, which means it's what it appears, but I know you do. Those were the fact that that candidate was not a sitting judge, so that doesn't apply to you. The second one was that he had not acted in the Constitutional Court, which applies to you. And the third one was that he was a white male, and you know what that means. So I'm not going to ask you, in the interest of time, about the other 2, because in your case, maybe unfairly, because I know you, and more importantly, I know your parents. I think that the progressive pedigree of where you come from should make the third issue maybe not that important. But I do want to ask you about this question of not having acted, because that is an issue that I'm quite sure will arise when we do our deliberations. If it does arise, I want to give you the opportunity to deal with it now, here and now, to say that despite the fact that you have never acted in the Constitutional Court, you do feel that because of whatever reasons you're going to give us, that issue might not be overlooked, but at least should be weighed against other issues. In other words, it should really be an ostensible disadvantage rather than a real one.
So let me respond to the question asked. I mean, everyone's experience is obviously something that you will all take account of and weigh in the balance, and those who have been fortunate enough to act in the Constitutional Court. That's something that is relevant to what they can bring to bear, and you will take that into account. I haven't been asked to act in the Constitutional Court, and it's not possible for candidates to say, well, I can in some way or another pursue a line which requires that I can tick that box, because that's not how acting appointments work. So it's not within my power to do that. But I do think that there are two things that I would ask you to bear in mind. The first of them is that I have had, I think, reasonably significant appellate experience. And I would say that in respect of 1.5 years in the Supreme Court of Appeal, my time on the Competition Appeal Court, and my time, as we've been discussing at some length, at the appellate body in a very sustained period of office. So I have, I think, fairly significant experience as an appellate judge, understanding how appellate courts work. And the SCA has been a very good experience for me. And many of the kinds of issues that we get, though they're not, that they come a little bit more across the spectrum, perhaps, than all the issues in the Constitutional Court, nevertheless gives one a fairly good vantage point to be able to, I think, act as an appellate judge, even at the apex level. But the second point I would make is just this, that, as I briefly sought to sketch at the beginning in some of my introductory remarks, I am relatively confident that I am the only candidate before this body that has actually appeared in the Constitutional Court for a period of some 27 years. Right from the beginning, I have seen every iteration of that court and been involved in some of its very key cases. And I would like you to consider that. I do think that I have a very full understanding and, more importantly, commitment to the court and the flourishing of that court. And I think I have I've been fortunate enough to be able to develop a practice in constitutional law that I think does suit me to the court. So I haven't acted. I would love to have done so. It hasn't come my way. And that, I should say, is certainly not a disqualification. It's simply how you weigh everything in the balance.
Thank you very much, DCJ. Just a quick one for my second question. It's just an idea that I thought only occurred in my head, but fortunately one of the candidates this morning mentioned it, about the need. Okay, let me put it just like as an idea and ask you to comment, that there might not be a need in a country like this, there might not be a need for a court like the SCA. Not because we don't need it, obviously, but maybe because we can't afford it. And most people cannot afford it. And it's something that I even thought I was going to write about. And the idea was that if we could strengthen the appellate capacity of the high courts, and that might involve a whole lot of things, it might well be that we could do away with the need for a litigant having to go to sometimes the magistrate court, the high court, the SCA, and then the constitutional court, because that just makes access to justice almost like not even a pipe dream for certain people. It's not a refined idea, as I said, it's something that was playing in my head, but one of the candidates actually put it boldly that we might have to do that. What do you think of that idea?
Well, I think that it has quite a bit to be said for it, in the sense that we have the present structure that we do because of the original bifurcation between the Constitutional Court as the ultimate decision maker on constitutional issues and the SCA as the final decision maker on all other issues. We now change that structure to make the Constitutional Court the apex court on all matters, and hence its need to be able to be the authoritative voice across the spectrum of legal issues that can come to it. But I do wonder, in a country such as ours, whether we therefore should, for all time, accept this tiered structure, which, you know, certainly works in the federal courts of the United States, but, you know, that is a large and very rich country. I could easily imagine that we might be able to, with certain fairly important rule changes, be able to collapse the Constitutional Court, or rather, let me not say collapse, amalgamate the Constitutional Court and the SCA, and reserve a full panel, as we now have in the Constitutional Court, for certain categories of very important case, but have others which are heard by panels of 5. And that might be a way of rationalizing appellate work with an institutional arrangement that is no less rigorous, but is possibly less costly to litigants and less time-consuming. So I haven't, like you, perhaps thought through everything about it, but it's certainly an idea that's worth putting on the table and thinking carefully about.
Thank you, DCJ. Thank you, Justice.
Thank you, Commissioner Mpofu. Before I go to Commissioner Nyambi, can I check commissioners who are virtual, whether there is anyone who has a question or wishes to ask questions?
Yes, Acting Chief Justice Singh here.
Yes, Commissioner Singh.
Thank you very much indeed. Good afternoon, Judge Unterhalter. I'd just like to know, you've been acting on the SCA for some time now, and it's a different kettle of fish than acting and than being a judge at a high court. What can you say about your working with other colleagues there and your sense of team building, etc.? Is there any experience that stands out for you?
Well, I should begin everything by saying that since I've been acting in the Supreme Court of Appeal, we have only been working virtually, and so it's a somewhat unusual experience to meet your colleagues virtually rather than in the courtroom and in chambers. But notwithstanding the constraints of the virtual world as we've come to know it, I have found the SCA to be an enormously collegial place where the panels of judges that are constituted to hear cases work in a very efficient manner with very great helpfulness to each other, and the way in which decisions are made and rendered for the most part in very quick time periods, short time periods, I have found to be an impressive feature of the SCA. So it seems to me to be a court in which a considerable body of work takes place, where there is a very strong work ethic. There is very considerable collegiality as between members of the court in getting on with the work that has to be done, and decisions are rendered pretty quickly. So I have to say it's a court that I've greatly enjoyed serving and which has many, many strengths attached to it.
Thank you. My next question will be with what you said in the end, that decisions are taken very quickly. What do you think about the time frames that the Constitutional Court takes to mete out certain judgments? Now, there are norms and standards for everybody else, but not for them. Somebody suggested this morning, well, 6 months should be a good enough time, but yet we know that there are judgments and findings that are much longer than that. Do you think there should be a particular time frame attached to by when judgment should be delivered in the CC?
Well, I'm peculiarly sensitive to this issue because when I sat and indeed led the appellate body, there is a provision in the relevant treaty which requires 90 days for the rendering of a decision, and that was often not possible to do when matters were extremely large and complex. And so I do understand that one can't, one has to adopt a rule which says that judgments must be rendered within both a reasonable time and with an eye to the value that that justice must be done with expedition. But I think there are two features of the Constitutional Court which do have to be borne in mind. The first is that it is our apex court, that it sometimes gets matters of very considerable gravity and complexity, and it is a large court where, by constitutional design, the court sits en banc. And that means that there are many opinions to assimilate, and there are institutional complexities as to how it goes about its work and gets its judgments out. But I think there has been criticism that has been offered that not every case that the Constitutional Court decides is of great complexity, and that it should certainly adhere to the general principle, as I'm sure it would recognize, that if not speedy justice, at least outcomes that come within fairly clear time periods is a value that is worth recognizing and respecting. And I have no doubt that we will get a new Chief Justice in the next few months, I'm sure, and that will be one of the things that the Chief Justice will want to think about as to, are there procedures that can be streamlined? Are there ways in which there can be much speedier ways of getting to an answer and then writing the judgments and getting them out in shorter time periods? Almost every institution needs to think through its practices and how it can be more efficient and how it can more effectively serve the public. And that includes the Constitutional Court, and I'm sure that is one of the things, in the light of some of the criticisms that have been offered, that those who are in charge of the court will give careful thought to.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Singh. I understand Commissioner Breitenbach would like to ask questions.
Thank you, Acting Chief Justice. I'm covered.
Oh, thank you. Then the next one is Commissioner Nyambi.
Thank you, Acting CJ. Afternoon, Judge.
Good afternoon.
My other questions were covered by Commissioner Madonsela and Commissioner Makwanish. I will ask just one question, so that I can be fair to you when doing the deliberations. I don't want to have wrong conclusions. As a judge that is aspiring to join the Constitutional Court, what is it that you consider your weakness?
My weakness?
Yes.
What is my weakness? Sorry, I don't mean to be vain. Everyone has weaknesses. I'm trying to capture something in a way that would be helpful to you while thinking about matters. You know, I think that I come to cases, as I think most judges do, with some sense of where the burden of the argument ultimately lies and where I think the answer lies. I spend time in the hearings that I sit in, testing how good those positions are, and engaging with counsel quite extensively to try to test my own thinking and whether I've missed something and whether I need to revise some of the thinking that I come into a case with. It may be sometimes that is more extensive than is absolutely necessary, but I think, on the other hand, that I remember well as counsel that even if you lost a case, at the end of the day, you do want to have the sense that your arguments have been heard and appreciated. And I have found that those engagements with counsel are often extremely helpful to me in testing myself and testing where the balance of the argument lies. But I would think I, need to make it as efficient as possible.
Do you consider that a weakness?
It could be, yes.
Thank you, Acting Chief Justice.
Thank you, Commissioner. And then I think the next one is Commissioner Motolo Hlepu.
Thank you, Acting Chief Justice. Good afternoon, Judge.
Good afternoon.
I think the issue of the WTO took a considerable time, but what I wanted to find out, since we've been in that court or whatever we call it, is there any decisions that were beneficial to South Africa that you know of?
Well, yes, I think there were many. South Africa has not been a litigant in the WTO system. South Africa was very nearly taken to the WTO dispute settlement system in respect of the subsidies that it gives to the auto industry, and Australia engaged South Africa, but that matter ultimately, as far as I know, resolved itself. So South Africa hasn't itself litigated or been a respondent in litigation. It might count itself lucky to have escaped some of that. The reason that I say it's benefited is because the jurisprudence of the appellate body has explained rules that are extremely valuable to all countries, but in certain aspects of WTO law, to developing countries and their interests. So let me, if I may, and I'm sorry this may seem somewhat technical, but let me give you an example where that is true. There is a part of the trade regime which concerns itself with anti-dumping duties, which are ways in which countries protect themselves by placing duties on goods where they believe that they're being dumped in the country. The United States pursued a policy for many, many years of something called zeroing, which was a particular technique for calculating dumping margins. The fact that it did so was extensively used by the United States to keep out, or at least minimize, imports, particularly in respect of steel, and was a critical part of the policy of the steel industry in the United States to protect themselves. Litigation and it was serial litigation before the appellate body, found that zeroing as a technique for the calculation of dumping margins was unlawful under WTO law, and the United States had to stop zeroing. It tried to do it in a whole variety of different ways, and every time it was taken to the appellate body and they got the same answer over and over again. It proved so controversial in the United States that it remains to this day a bone of enormous contention that the United States has against the WTO system at large. But what did it do? Well, it helped, for example, South African steel makers export their goods without that disadvantage to the United States. So that's just one illustration of where the rules and the interpretation of the rules is critical to the way in which developing countries, our own included, where we have exports across a wide array of goods, can either be made or broken by the kinds of ways in which these rules are interpreted and applied.
Okay, thank you for that. I think you touched on the anti-dumping. That's where I was going, because the issue of chicken dumping into South Africa, you read it in the newspapers, and I just wonder, why can't we protect ourselves? Because, that's the second question that I wanted to raise is, you have been an SC for quite some time.
Yes.
And you have a lot of experience, as they say. I just found now recently that SCs don't take pupils. Why is that? And do you think it's a good thing?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's an old convention, and whether it should be perpetuated, I'm not so certain. I can tell you what I think the rationale for it is, which is that pupils coming in to be trained can often best get experience with practitioners, advocates who are not already running very advanced practices. So typically, when you come to the bar and you know very little about how to engage the courts and their procedures and so on, it doesn't always help to be thrown into an extremely complicated matter. So I think the idea was always that training is best done, because that's what pupillage is, by junior counsel whose practices are more varied and might have a greater connection to the entry level at which advocates come in. But I say this subject to one important caveat, which is that it is very important for seniors to open up their practices, not just to juniors, as I've tried to say I did when I was at the bar, but to be able to recognize that there are other ways outside formal pupillage of recognizing those who come to the bar and how mentorship and exposure to practice can help them along, not just in pupillage, but afterwards, because you know, it's like getting a driver's license. Some people would say you only really learn to drive after you've got the license. And so it's a lifelong question, and that's partly why I spent a great deal of time doing training and advocacy training, which is a great value that the bar brings to what it does, and has been hugely helpful to many, many practitioners. So I agree with you that it may not be a hard and fast rule. There might be circumstances in which silks should take pupils, but I can see that by and large, as long as silk's doors are open and they do use their positions to encourage juniors and in turn the juniors' pupils, I think there is enough to go around in terms of sharing experience and engaging in mentorship. I'm not certain in all instances that a silk will always be able to give a pupil the best introduction. Aspects of their practice, yes, but to sit for a year with somebody when a silk is dealing with large and very complex matters may not always be the best way of training people.
Just a follow-up, just little. I think you are getting where I'm trying to get. Because if you're saying you are doing silk, you are doing complex matters, this is what we lack training in as women practitioners and black practitioners. So if silk decides, have a discretion of deciding whom to train and not to train, this is why we are in the state. Don't you think so?
Well, I would suggest this as a way in which this can work sequentially, which is that silks should be very open to appreciating the talent that exists among junior advocates, and particularly among black and women advocates who traditionally have been excluded from very important areas of law. And you can see in terms of the flourishing, as I was describing earlier, of so many black and women practitioners at the bar, that it's an opportunity issue. And given the opportunity, they can flourish. So that should be the vantage point and outlook that silks have, to open their practices to the possibility of the great talent that exists at the bar. The juniors then in turn, if they have pupils, will involve their pupils in that work, and you will not find that people get stereotyped, that their practices end up, only in crime or family law or whatever it is, but that their talents can be recognized in wider areas. So I think we're in basic agreement, which is that openness to people, making the determined availability of opportunity is absolutely critical. Training is essential, and simply recognizing that very often we have seen that people have just been systematically denied opportunities to shine, and everybody needs someone to back them and to say, I see your potential and I will give you that chance. And that's what it's all about at the end of the day.
Okay, thank you.
Minister wants to just do a follow-up question. Minister.
Yeah, just a follow-up on that point where you ended, and on the empowerment of black women practitioners. I heard you earlier on, you also mentioned the black advocates that you have empowered and so forth. And on that score, I did not hear you mention any female. Can you mention one female that you empowered, you have worked with and mentored and so forth?
Are these women as a category?
Yes, a black woman.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Advocate Beloy is one of them. I mean, I've got a long list of them here, but certainly she is one of them who I would put on that list.
CJ.
Thank you.
CJ, just on that one, I know I'm still coming.
Yeah, okay, all right.
No, I hear you saying you've got many of them and you mentioned one. Just mention two.
Let me just look on the list. Excuse me, I'm just trying to, yes, well, Ms. Raja Budlander is another. Yeah, she is black.
Yeah, okay. It is your turn, Commissioner Malema.
No, I just want to ask a quick one. What is the worth of this acting stint in the High Court or even worse in the Constitutional Court? Is it worth considering it when you want to appoint judges?
Well, I do think that experience matters, and how one gains that experience can go by different routes. But I do think that when one overall assesses somebody's experience, to have had experience of a court is one way in which one can reckon on someone's suitability, but it's not a requirement, because we know that some of the leading judges appointed to the Constitutional Court never acted in the Constitutional Court. Certain of them barely acted in the Supreme Court of Appeal.
No, I hear that, but I'm just saying, I know it's not a requirement, but is it worth considering, or is it something that we must just overlook and consider any other person? Here's a person who acted in the Constitutional Court, and then here's a person who has not acted in the Constitutional Court, but they are of good quality, both of them. They are very good. The only difference is that this one acted, the other one did not act. Will I be unfair in considering the one who acted in the Constitutional Court over the one who did not act in the Constitutional Court, given the fact that their qualities are of the same? The only difference is that experience of acting in the Constitutional Court.
Yes, I think that would be an extraordinarily mechanistic way of assessing candidates, because it is under the guise of simply looking at experience, you're creating it as a requirement. So you will never find candidates who on every criterion are equal in every way, and the only difference between them is that one has acted and one has not. That's not how candidates ever present, because they have different life experience, different professional experience, and so they have strengths and weaknesses in different areas. But let me give you a concrete example which may be of assistance practically for the decisions that you've got to take. The Constitutional Court is an apex court that now takes cases across the legal spectrum in every area of the law. You might find somebody who has acted in the Constitutional Court, but their experience is, for example, largely an expertise in public law. And you might say to yourself, well, that's an attribute and it's good and it's useful, but we might be looking, when we think about how to constitute the Constitutional Court, given its expansive jurisdiction, to people who have got experience in some of the areas that have figured and continue to figure increasingly in the Constitutional Court, because that matters. So There is commercial law, there is company law, there is contract law, there is intellectual property law, there is taxation. These are all the things that the Constitutional Court considers, apart from constitutional and administrative law. And so that's why I think, with respect, people you don't just get this sort of, they're equal, but the only difference is this. They have their own trajectory, their own experience, and you have to ultimately think, what does that court need? How are we going to make it the best, most authoritative court that it can be?
Judge, when we say you are equal, we don't talk about your experiences of life. We mean you are both good. Let me put a different question of good people. There it's you, a white male, very good. Here is Ngugai Tobi, an African male, very good. It's not because you've got the same life experiences. You are just good lawyers, and you interviewed so well. You are what we are looking for. But the only difference is that when it comes to the transformation agenda, you do not fit that purpose. Will I be wrong to consider a black male over you?
Well, again, I would, when I talk about experience, I'm not talking about life experience, and you now posit a situation where we're talking about experience and competence as lawyers, which is, I think, the focus of your question. And I would say to you this, that the Constitution clearly requires representativity, and I don't need to refer that. You have it firmly in your mind as to what is required, and that's a consideration that is relevant in thinking about how to constitute the Constitutional Court. It should roughly be representative. So that's one question. But the Constitution also has an idea, which I think is a powerful idea, that we are a diverse country, and we want to harness the strengths of our diversity to a shared end. That's actually our greatest strength. And so it's not ultimately a question of you're in, you're out, because ultimately you are black or you are white. It's a question of saying, given all the talents that we can muster to make this court authoritative and the best court, as I say, it can be, who has got ultimately the best qualities for that purpose? And that's something where we draw on diversity, but we recognize representativity. And that, I'm afraid, is the balancing act that is your job, not mine. And so again, I would say, you know, those talents need to be harnessed and they need to be applied, and we need to think about this court in the light of that.
Thank you. TCJ.
Thank you, Commissioner Malema.
Chair, can I do a quick follow-up?
Yes, Commissioner Klaba.
Just a quick follow-up on the question that Commissioner Malema raised. You have been shortlisted. The two candidates, I just want to make an example of the two candidates that he's talking about. Shortlisted, and they both have the requisite experience and the qualities. The question is, do you consider the acting stint as an added advantage? I think that was the essence of the question.
Of course it's an advantage to someone to have acted in the court, undoubtedly. But it's equally an advantage to have acted in the Supreme Court of Appeal. And if I must speak to my own brief, which is what I'm doing here, it is this body must decide, is it advantageous to appoint to the Constitutional Court a lawyer who has served on an international court and led that court, and it is one of the busiest courts in the world. Now, you can say, no, well, that's not an attribute, but acting in the Constitutional Court for 6 months is an attribute. You could come to that conclusion, but I would respectfully suggest to you it would be a very eccentric conclusion to come to.
Thank you. I don't remember that in your CV I picked up anything that tells us why you didn't make yourself available to come to the bench much earlier, maybe 10 years ago.
Yes.
And I asked that question partly because this might have nothing to do with you, but it's like there is pressure that you have to be appointed now. You have to be appointed now. Whereas maybe if you had come to you had made yourself available much earlier, there would not have been that pressure.
Yes.
You would have been before us with maybe 10 years of judicial experience in a South African court, you know, doing the types of cases that when you get to the Concord will be dealing with, you know. So I don't know if you want to say something about why you delayed and made yourself available only after 27 years of practice.
Yes. Well, I'm grateful for the inquiry because it was one of the issues that arose last time, and I would very much like to explain. I'd given you some of the dates in respect of what I had done over my time at the bar. And the truth is that there are only so many things that you can do over a career that you have. So I explained that I went to head CALS and the Center for Applied Legal Studies, and then established the Mandela Institute. And that took up some 5 years of my professional life. So that was one thing that I did. I then worked in the WTO in a judicial capacity, and that took up a further 8 years in an appellate capacity. And if you put all of those together, it takes me quite far into the period in which I have been an advocate. So it's not as if I spent 27 years as an advocate at the bar, and then it occurred to me late in the day, well, now maybe is the time to become a judge. I had taken time to do things, be an academic, run CALS, start the Mandela Institute, take up an international position of some importance both for the country and the continent. And that then meant that when I came back, and the judge president of my division will confirm this to you, when I went to see him about the possibility of taking up judicial appointments, he said to me, you need to come and start acting, because it was a rule of the WTO that you couldn't occupy a position in your government, your home government, and judicial acting since were counted as acting for within your government. So I couldn't act. So when I finished at the WTO in 2013 or 14, I had to start getting experience as an acting judge. And as soon as I had clocked up enough experience as an acting judge, I felt confident enough to then come and offer myself in 2017 for a position on the High Court. So I do think that I have spent my time in practice, not only practicing as I did as a silk, but doing a number of things that are relevant to the Constitutional Court and Judicial Office. But I don't think I could practically have made myself available for the High Court any sooner than I did, given when I finished on the appellate body. So unless the JSE takes the view that I should not have sought to represent South Africa, not sought to be a lawyer from this continent who discharged a function in the WTO, I should rather have declined all of that so as to come sooner to a High Court position, well, then that will be your judgment. But I do think that I came to take up, I will make myself available for High Court office as soon as I could, given when I finished at the WTO.
One of the factors...
CJ, can I make a follow-up on that one?
Yes.
Because I'm not sure, and I'm trying to check here on the computer. It looks like when you came for the High Court interview, we asked you if you are not in transit, rushing to somewhere like the Constitutional Court, and you gave us an assurance that no, you are here, you are not in transit and all of that. And all of a sudden, speaking to what the Deputy Chief Justice is trying to speak to, it looks like there is some hurry to go into the Constitutional Court. And this reminds me of, if I'm wrong, then I will accept. But it looks like when you came, some of us had the same reservation that it looks like you are in transit to somewhere higher than where you are actually applying for. Did we have that conversation?
I don't recall being asked if I was in transit, but your memory may well be better than mine. But certainly I came to the High Court to do the job of a High Court judge, and my boss is here with you, so he will tell you if you ask him. Have I served as a High Court judge in every single capacity and requirement without any expectation of preferment in any way? And the answer is yes. I have done exactly what every High Court judge has done. I have been very fortunate that I have been asked to act in the Supreme Court of Appeal, and I've been there for 1.5 years, and I've gained greatly from the experience. The question as to whether, should I be asked to wait or whatever, is obviously something you can bear in mind, but it does rather suggest that this is a question of waiting your time before you can actually assume a position in any court. And I would just say to you that ultimately it's not a question of whether I should be required to wait or anyone else should. It's a question of what does the court need? What's going to be good for the court? What's going to be good for the legal system? What's going to be good for the country? That's the critical question ultimately that you need to ask yourself. And if there are others who can serve better than I, well, then you'll make that decision. But I don't think that the question of whether one is suitable for appointment is a question of wait in line and take your turn when you've given 10 or more years. The question is, what does the court need, and who comes before you that you think will serve that court best? And as we know, and I think it's been said to you on a number of occasions, some of the most distinguished members of the Constitutional Court have had very little experience in the High Court and indeed in the Supreme Court of Appeal. The former Deputy Chief Justice, Justice Moseneke, is one example, and he was one of our most distinguished judges.
One of the factors that we have to consider in making the types of decisions that we have to make is what possible message a certain appointment may send out. Now, in your case, it may well be that one message that could be sent out if you were to be included in the list that goes to the president and the president appoints you, may be that it would be that there is a recognition of experience, even experience acquired outside of the shores of South Africa, WTO, and so on. So, in other words, where that experience and that expertise is recognized an appointment will be made. That might be one message. But is it not possible that another message would be this, that there may be a judge, there may be judges who, let's say, who are in the High Court or who is in the High Court, let's say one, maybe who was in practice as an advocate or as an attorney alongside yourself, who says, 10 years ago, I made a sacrifice and made myself available to serve as a judge, to be appointed as a judge. I wanted to still continue working as an advocate for another 10 years and make 27 years and make money before going to the bench. But I sacrificed all of that in order to render service to the judiciary and to my country. So I've been serving Advocate Unterhalter, Judge Unterhalter was making money all these years, and now he comes 2 years, 3 years ago, he comes to the bench, and then the next thing he's parachuted to the highest court. I'm still going through the ranks here. Isn't that another possible message that could be sent out? And then maybe when we try and encourage practitioners to come to the bench, they say, wait, let me finish 27 years, then I'll come. Because I will have made money and I can come and go to the top court within a few years. So I put this to you because, at least as far as I'm concerned, it's important that when we make any decision, we think about what message it could send out.
Yes.
Positive or negative.
Yes. ACJ, I completely understand that, that the notion that, you know, anyone should assume that they can come to the judiciary and sort of leapfrog into the highest court in the land is a message that you would want to think carefully about, but I don't think that that is my position. If I had spent 27 years at the bar simply wanting to pursue a high-flown practice which was very lucrative and then come to the bench and say, well, now I expect to be elevated in a very short period of time, I can understand that there would be criticism and there would be questions raised. But that is not my position. I don't see the work that I did on the appellate body as sacrifice. I considered it to be an enormous honor and an enormous privilege. But the fact of the matter is, it wasn't time that I spent taking lucrative briefs in commercial cases. It was service to the country, to the continent, and ultimately to the international community. And that's what I spent 11 years doing. So to the person who came to the bench 10 years ago, I would say, well, I went to the bench 11 years ago. So if you consider that to be sacrificial, which I don't, nevertheless, I'm in a comparably or probably a stronger position than you are. So that's the first thing I would say. And the second thing I would say is that beyond judicial office, when over my 27 years at the bar, as I've sought to illustrate perhaps too often before you, I took time out to do things that were also of public service. The CALS is an institution of very great importance in terms of the issues that it served, the public interest litigation it undertook. You will recall its distinguished role in respect of many human rights issues, and similarly the establishment of the Mandela Institute. Again, I didn't see it as a sacrifice. I thought it as something enormously worthwhile to do. But that was another 5 years of my professional life. So I'm now at I'm not doing the maths, but I'm now at 16 or 17 years. And the last thing I would say is that I was not a practitioner at the bar who spent 27 years simply going after the most lucrative commercial cases I could find to amass money. I've set out in my CV, but it's perhaps worth reminding, that I did a very considerable amount of pro bono work. I assisted on the formulation of the Water Act and the complete reformulation of our way of thinking of water as property. I was involved in the first asbestosis case in respect of the unbundling of GenCorp, where we got hundreds of millions of rand, which at the time was an enormous sum, for the compensation of asbestosis sufferers. I was involved in the negotiations in respect of the export of wine from our country when the negotiations took place with the European Union, all pro bono. I then did many, many cases in diverse areas on private members' bills, on environmental issues, on the nuclear transaction, on the fact that there is now a regime in place that requires the disclosure of monies in respect of political parties. These were all matters done. And I might even lastly remind Councillor Malema that I actually acted for the EFF pro bono in respect of litigation that they did against Ms. Nglakula of the IEC, where the only thing I asked in compensation was a memento of a red beret, and he still hasn't produced it for me.
Thank you, Judge Unterhalter. Thank you very much.
Acting CJ, you forgot about me, but
I'm sorry.
I will forgive you, Acting CJ, because...
Actually, I didn't even write you down. I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
No, Acting CJ, I'm actually covered.
Oh, you're covered.
But I just wanted to ask, and it's in response to the question you asked.
Okay, sorry.
It's in response to...
Okay, you can go ahead and ask.
Thank you, Acting CJ. Good afternoon, Justice Unterhalter. In your answer to the CJ about your stint in the appellate body and the panel, can I ask, were you still practicing at that time, or was it just purely in that position?
No, I certainly did manage to do some practice, but it was very residual in comparison to, as I've said, the work that I was doing on the WTO, because we had to be available at all times. And just illustratively, I think I'd mentioned earlier the litigation around the subsidies in respect of Airbus and Boeing, which has only recently been resolved. I mean, these were enormous cases that went on for years and years, and it was a very, very substantial involvement. So, yes, I did manage to carry on practicing, but it was residual in comparison to what I was doing in Geneva.
Thank you, Acting CJ. Thank you, Justice Unterhalter.
Thank you. Can I regard Commissioner Schlema's hand as the last hand?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, ACJ. I think you didn't see me earlier on.
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't, yeah.
Most of the things that I wanted to ask was already asked, but I should perhaps just declare again for the new commissioners that I know Judge Unterhalter. He was a professor at Wits where I teach. And something that I think you didn't mention enough is the role that you still play in academia. The fact that you still teach and that you've been doing that for quite some time as well. Together with the work that you do in practice and the work that you did at the appellate body of the WTO.
Yes, well, thank you for reminding me. I mentioned it briefly, but perhaps I should just emphasize that ever since I went to the bar and after accepting appointment to the bench, I have taught at firstly Wits and thereafter at UCT, and continue to do so. And I continue to write articles and publish in books and journals to this day. One of my pieces is coming out in the Oxford Handbook on International Trade Law. So I've continued to pursue academic interests, and I have a great respect, as you know, for the academic community. And I do think that some of those interests and inclinations are matters of importance to the Constitutional Court, because the authority and respect with which the court is regarded, in a sense, is appraised very critically by the academic community. And it's a community I know, respect, and understand, and I would hope to do a job in the Constitutional Court which would provide them with good material, but also which would make my contribution to make the court one that academics, whatever their criticisms, are justly proud of, as indeed should all South Africans be.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have come to the end of this interview, Judge Unterhalter. Once again, thank you very much for availing yourself. I should have said when you started, and I should have said to those who, maybe two or so who were before you, I should have apologized that we were running late, and so everyone has had to wait for some time. I apologize for that, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
You are now
indeed.
excused.
Thank you.
Thank you.